people don't know about the Canadian market, but that frankly has become a little bit out of control. I'm going to share my own kind of personal views, which I don't do all that often as a lawyer, but in this case, I think this is an organization that has a mandate.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey folks, we're ready for a Simply Trade podcast show for our Canadian listeners. This is a new show that we have launched, and I have a co-host, Kim Campbell, who is, it's like Kim and I go back a ways, and I'm telling you, you've heard some of the stories on it. A lot of you know Kim, obviously, definitely know you. They know you up there in the Great White North, right?
Absolutely.
With that, I will say that I am excited for today's show. Kim, this series of shows, this is, again, something that I'm really intrigued with. There are so many transactions and trading partners of Canada and the U.S. being very large trading partners, but Canada and the rest of the world, whether it's Canadian imports, exports, all kinds of things going on. There's a lot of things happening on the Canadian side of things. So anything you want to start off with here from your perspective?
I'd love to. Thank you, Andy. It's so much fun to be here and officially kind of kicking off our secret that we have the trade, Simply Trade A, and I'm co-hosting with you. So that's very exciting. Thank you so much to you and Lalo for giving us this opportunity. We've done a couple on CARM, a little informal ones to see how that would go. So very happy to be here today, not talking about that 4-letter word, but we have different problems to tackle, which are in some ways just as daunting. And so I'll talk about Will in a second here, but I was at a conference this week, and Ambassador Cohen, U.S. Ambassador to Canada, talked a lot about the importance of our relationship, to your point, Andy, and the amount of trade that continues to go across the border every single day is really still, I wouldn't say significant, like critical to both of our economies. And we peel back and look at even states, 35 states, really, we are your biggest customer. So it's really imperative that we work so closely together and, keep all of our friendships and our good connections as we start to think about 2026 with USMCA renegotiations, because it's critical for our two countries, including our good friends in Mexico, to keep that intact and make sure that we're all doing well together.
That's that North American thing. I was trying to it's like, it's tough enough to try and get something going here in the U.S. It's tough enough in Canada. Now we're going to herd cats and try and get Canada, U.S., and Mexico all on the same page.
Well, the good news is we've done it before with our free trade agreement, right? So that's all good. Obviously, it's going to be a little different this time because we're going to have potentially different leaders for sure in 2 of the countries. Maybe 3 by the time the thing starts really renegotiating. So that will be interesting. But we're here to talk about forced labor today, Canadian style. So I'm introducing Will Pellerin to the conversation today. Will has been so gracious to help IE Canada, my volunteer job, with our members over many years at various summits. So I thought Will would be the perfect person to talk about forced labor today because he has lots of experience. And certainly we've had a busy last few weeks getting many clients in to meet the mandated requirement of May 31st filing, which we'll talk about a little bit in a second. So Will, in Canada, we're a little bit different. We don't have the big complement that you do, Andy, in the U.S. with trade lawyers. We have a very finite special group. So Will is one of these amazing folks, and happy to introduce him to the podcast here and potentially a lot of your listeners, because after today, they might need Will to help them with some forced forced labor stuff because it is very unique in Canada. And it's been my experience because the U.S. has done such a great job leading the world in terms of your eyes on forced labor and what US CBP is doing. A lot of American companies that are importing into Canada or oversighting Canada are actually a little bit surprised to see what's going on here because they have done good work over many years and just thought they would be fine with any of the US regulations. So now we're learning it's a little bit different. And that's kind of what we wanted to go over today. Will also is very special. I want to call him one of those unicorns out there in trade law because he actually did work in the government as well at one point. So he also gives us a special extra insight and expertise that really doesn't exist in our country. So Will, very happy to have you here today. Andy, we're kind of thinking we're going to maybe talk about 4 different things. We're going to talk about the new legislation that just went in. Well, I guess the mandated report, it's been in for a while, but the mandated report for this year was due on Friday last week, May 31st, which we call Bill S211. And so Will's going to talk a little bit about that and maybe share his experiences. I can too. It's certainly been helping clients understand it, get ready. Sometimes I refer them over to Will because they need his help for obvious reasons. But I'm always a little bit surprised at how many people aren't aware of that. So we just want to raise that awareness, but also talk a little bit about, for those folks that are maybe hearing it for the first time and didn't make the reporting time frame, the things we're learning this week about how that might look and feel. We're going to talk a little bit about border prohibition, which is kind of like the U.S. piece, which we have those frameworks here. We're just not seeing much of that activity. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about core, which is, I feel, one of those outlier things that maybe people aren't aware of, but perhaps maybe is the most troubling part of our framework right now. And this is where people can make complaints, and there's an ombudsman that goes through that. They're publicly listed. I know Will's had experience with a client helping them through that. I think a lot of people really need to know about that one because that's a bit of an outlier and you might not know about it. And then we're maybe going to read the tea leaves at the end. There is new legislation that we expect to be introduced this year that will add a due diligence component into it, which is going to add a whole bunch of much more fun and complication. So, Andy, that's kind of what we're thinking we'd like to talk about today.
Sounds good. And I will say, Will, welcome to the show. Before we get too far along in this, is that where are you located right now? Are you in the Toronto area?
I'm in Ottawa, so I'm at Macmillan. So I'm a partner in the International Trade Group at Macmillan here in Canada. Macmillan's a national business law firm. We're located everywhere in Canada, but most of our international trade team, which is for the Canadian market, quite a big trade team, is located here in Ottawa. So the nation's capital, and from here we're leading the charge on all things trade, including forced labor, and it's fantastic to be here. This is my first podcast. I do a lot of kind of legal commentary with the press and the media, but this is a whole different ballpark and a lot more fun, frankly. So thanks for having me. This is great.
So this new legislation that you're talking about there, Kim, that you what'd you call it? S number 2?
211, but there's actually an official name. Will's probably going to be the one that's going to rattle off the long name. I feel it's like a 2-sentence name of the actual legislation, but we refer to it as that. So I don't know if if you want to give a little bit of a framework of what the bill is.
Sure. It really doesn't have a snappy acronym. I blame the parliamentarians. The name of the bill is Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act. Just rolls off the tongue, really. So we'll call it either the Supply Chains Act or the Modern Slavery Act or Bill S211, which was kind of its numbering. All those things are effectively the same thing. And so this became law Jan 1st of this year. And what it does is really 2 things. And the main thing that we're going to talk about right now is it creates this reporting obligation for companies in Canada, but also international businesses that do any type of business in Canada to file these forced labor reports that basically describe how entities are addressing forced labor or child labor in their supply chain. So this is very similar to, for those that are in the UK or Australia or even California has a bit of a requirement similar. It's a transparency bill. So you describe what it is that you're doing to fight forced labor or child labor. There's no diligence piece to that, though. So what I mean by that is you don't actually need to be doing anything to fight forced labor or child labor. You just have to report on what it is you are doing. So thousands of companies have now filed these reports by Friday last week. This was a massive undertaking by trade lawyers, trade consultants, and everyone else in the Canadian market to try to get everyone up and running and preparing these reports. We were assisting dozens upon dozens of major multinational companies and, local Canadian businesses getting themselves organized and filed. So these have to be filed with the government, uploaded onto a portal. They have to be posted on the company's website. And they had to be approved by the board of directors of the company themselves. And so in some cases, we were, chasing down multinational boards out, in Korea or in Japan or in the United States, trying to get these folks to sign off on these forced labor reports and educating them. So massive undertaking, massive kudos to all those that got it done in time. And frankly, really happy that it's almost over.
So, Will, now that we've probably given a lot of people a heart attack about the report, because some of them are thinking, oh my God, I know nothing about it. Maybe we can just share the criteria that...
The simplest way to think about this was it was kind of a three-part test, right? So you had to have some nexus to Canada. So you either had to have a place of business in Canada, assets in Canada, or you were doing business in Canada. Doing business in Canada is a very broad term, but generally you would know if you're filing taxes in Canada, right? If your entity is filing taxes in Canada, you're probably almost certainly doing business in Canada, whether it's GST, HST, the sales tax, or your income tax. So that could be, a foreign business that's an importer of record acting as a non-resident importer into Canada, for example, bringing product in. It could be someone that has a couple employees involved in the sale of product, even if they're not a Canadian business at all. So that's part one. Do you have that nexus to Canada? Part two was size thresholds. You had to meet certain size thresholds to be included. So tiny, SMEs weren't caught by this. You had to hit two of the three of 40 million in revenue, 20 million in assets, or have 250 or more employees. So two of the three of the revenue, 40 million, assets, 20 million, employees, 250. And so if you hit that, then you're an entity, and that's part two. Part three is the activities test. You have to be involved in something that the government actually cared about here, which was you had to be either producing goods anywhere in the world or importing goods into Canada. So if you are a manufacturer in the United States, even if you're not the one doing the importation activities, because you're producing goods and you have that nexus to Canada, you're in. You had to file by May 31st. And the penalties for not filing are really significant, or up to $250,000 for failure to file. And there's personal liability on the boards of directors for companies that fail to file and so on. So now, we don't think much enforcement is going to occur here. Year one, we heard many times from the regulator, which is Public Safety Canada, that it was all about education, that they're not going to be, tracking down and breaking down doors on this. But nonetheless, this is a really kind of significant piece of new legislation that does have teeth.
So I guess though too, Will, just to highlight that, even if they're not doing enforcement, technically you're not compliant.
Yeah, you're non-compliant and they could enforce. And then you have all sorts of other problems where anytime you have some sort of transaction that you're trying to do with your company, you can't certify that you're compliant with Canadian law, that you've done what you need to meet your kind of supply chain obligations. So you might be in a world of hurt, in a number of other ways, contractually with your supply chain partners, even if you're not, being tracked down by the government.
All right. So let me jump in on a question here then, is that with this legislation, who within a company should in particular be, shall you say, taking ownership of adhering to the this new law?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In fact, it really depends on the company and how they're structured. So many of our clients, the more, the big multinationals, very sophisticated entities, we were dealing often with their kind of sustainability team or their ESG teams. And they have all their kind of ducks in a row and know about these requirements internationally. So Canada's just kind of the latest piece to the game. So we do it, they get their board to approve, and that's that. Sometimes it's the chief of compliance, right? Really kind of an internal compliance function that's leading on this. In other cases, it was really led by the legal team. And finally, what we saw a lot of was trade compliance folks that were really kind of involved in seeing this first and foremost. And that would happen a lot with American companies because forced labor in the United States is primarily kind of a trade compliance issue. It's a border issue, right? And so people were seeing forced labor in Canada and saying, oh, well, I guess this is us. We're the forced labor people within this company. So I guess we have to draft this report for Canada now. And then they would run it up the flagpole and get their, head of legal or their CEO to approve, and then it'd go to the board and get signed. So it really depends on the structure of the business and how they're organized. But we basically saw every permutation under the sun there. I don't know if there's a right answer or wrong answer, but
I think the right answer was somebody needs to know at the company for sure. And I can tell you too, Andy, just on my journey over the last, couple of years talking about this at conference in the US, it was a lot of time the trade compliance folks that were certainly identifying it and bringing the information internally. And then what William just described, or Will just described, was any one of those people might be taking the charge at that point. I had a mixed bag myself, even in my own space.
Okay, so to that point, I guess this, if you are again a compliance side of things, you're going to have to look at and don't just kind of whine and carry it on. I mean, you got to put together the in a succinct message, as far as what needs to happen with the company and to implement it, because executives don't have time to go through a dissertation of something in there. I would say that if Canada Customs looks at this, and I assume it's Customs that would be the policing agency.
No, that's a great point. It actually is not. And that's uniquely different from the U.S. too. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what is the agency that is responsible for policing this particular law?
Public Safety Canada, which I guess has some similar overlaps to kind of your Department of Homeland Security in some ways. So yeah, Public Safety Canada. Now we do have, and we'll get to this in a bit, we do have now also a prohibition at the border on the importation of goods made of forced labor. And that is handled by the, Canada Border Services Agency, by Customs. Yeah.
Okay. So here's my question. So with the Department of Public Safety, did you call it? Okay. With the Department of Public Safety, and they go and they say, okay, XYZ company is just non-compliant. We're going to take action. To whom are they looking to hold responsible in a particular company?
Yeah. So, I mean, the company itself gets fined or could get fined if they decided to go down this kind of enforcement path. I don't think it'll happen this year, but it absolutely could. It's in the statute. And then beyond that, they are also allowed to pierce the corporate veil and actually go after the directors themselves.
Okay, so let's say that's when we say directors in this case, you're talking about board of directors?
Board of directors, correct. Yeah, the members of the board.
So you're talking even beyond the C-suite, you're talking about the governing body of the corporation.
Exactly right.
Okay, so the reason I'm asking that is that in this particular show, folks, you need to get this to your corporate legal department who has the board of director responsibilities as far as relations and that kind of stuff. So it is the C-suite, but I can assure you if the board members are receiving inquiries from the Canadian government, in this case, the Department of Public Safety, they're going to turn right around and look at the C-suite and go, what the hell are you guys doing?
Yeah. It's serious. It's serious business. And that's where, all of a sudden, sometimes it's Canada. What craziness could Canada possibly get up to? It's a small market for us, company so-and-so, right? And then all of a sudden they realize that there's, personal liability on the boards of directors of some multinational company, and everyone loses their minds really, really quickly. And let me tell you, it gets escalated within, the bowels of a large company pretty darn quick.
Well, can you also maybe highlight about the report? Like, not only do you have to file it with the government, but it actually has to be made public as well?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So, that's absolutely right, Kim. The whole idea here is it's all about transparency, right? So it's all about name and shame, because actually hitting the legal requirements in terms of what you have to say in this report is really easy, right? Because there's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no diligence requirement. There's nothing that you actually have to do. You could file a report, Andy and Kim, that says, we are doing nothing to fight forced labor and child labor in our supply chain. And that would get you like 90% of the way there to your report, right? If you file that, you're absolutely off your rockers, right? Like that would be a terrible thing to file from a reputational perspective. But from a legal perspective, it would be fine. So the whole idea here is to encourage people to do more and to take, a deeper look at their supply chains. And do more tracing and do more diligence and do more training and all these sorts of things that you have to report on, so that in the future you report, that you're not ashamed of putting out this report, frankly. So it has to go up on your website. And we're frankly seeing a whole lot of companies start asking their suppliers what they're doing, right? And so even though this is just about transparency, if I'm the government here, I'm actually liking the outcome quite a bit, because we're already seeing real actions being taken. We're seeing a lot more companies start doing training because they want to report that they've done training on forced labor. We're starting to see companies that are already putting in new codes of ethics and new vendor codes of conduct because they want to be able to say that they have these things, that they've done the work. Companies are doing way more tracing already in Canada, supply chain tracing, and trying to go up to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers because they want to be able to say it and not be ashamed of where they've been so far. So in that sense, the bill is actually, highly successful from the government perspective.
Also say that, yes, there's a lot of companies that are just now changing some things. They finally realize they need to do something. Like some of the compliance people, they're probably hoarse from shouting out so much, you've got to do this, whatever. Okay, so they're finally getting there. There is, in dealing with so much massive amounts of data, and it's in different places and all of that, this right here is where the application of artificial intelligence technology or AI technology and empowering the not only your import-export compliance groups, but your supply chain management folks and the different aspects of it would come into play and make you much more effective. So, we're not going to be getting into the details on this now, but that's one where I've just got some other shows. We just had a great strategic discussion on AI and how it would really benefit companies, not taking your job, but actually making them more effective. And the red flags of, hey, you know what? You've got a part or a widget in your arsenal of goods that you're trying to sell that has a red flag on it that their tier 3, supplier may be using forced labor, and that's a red flag comes up. You better be checking that out instead of now ahead of time versus wait till it gets to a port and then you're going to lose it, or you'll have to scramble to do something. So that's something that comes in play.
Sure, that would be one tool potentially that people would be reporting on, but this report is like really much more fulsome than that. Even that would just be one component in my head that you could obviously do your due diligence to do that. But such a good and important point, Andy, for sure. I wouldn't mind just also leveraging what Will just said, though. As much as there is this mandated folks that have to report, I think Will also has just highlighted it's people outside of that too, because for sure what's happening is now these companies that are mandated reporters are going back through their supply chain. So I don't think anyone is exempt from it. It's even SMEs are going to have to deal with it because they're going to have to prove to these folks that they have made sure that none of this stuff was a forced labor. So as much as there's a free pass right now, potentially for them having to file a report, that work is now really starting to take hold, as Will pointed out, and those people can all expect to have some skin in the game around their part in making sure that forced labor is not in the supply chain.
And let me make a point here again, with our listeners, folks, yeah, you're having to do a report for this law as it appears. But what's the intent here? The intent is drilling in to say, do you have somebody or a product that you're buying from somebody that is using, the forced labor, child labor, or doing something nefarious that they shouldn't be doing? That this is a way, and in the laws, the whole intent here is not to make it a bureaucratic nightmare for you, but it should be one of those things. And I think you said, hit it, Will. This is something that you ought to be proud as a company to say, look at what we've done. And hey, you know what? We did find a problem, but we're jumping on it. So it's like that, we're going to get that fixed and be on that quicker than a duck jumping on a June bug going after it. It's like, hey, we're going to get this fixed and resolve the issue and move on. So yeah, we're proud of not only of what we done, but hey, we did uncover some things. Turn it around and make it a positive. We discovered some things that have been there all along, and we're doing something about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we had some clients that were frankly very pleased to be able to do this, and they knew that they'd look better than their competitors when they put out their report, right? So it's a competitive thing also. If you can show that you're better at having a clean supply chain than your competitor, that's a competitive advantage that you can flaunt in the market, right? So
Yeah, I'm wondering, Will, might be smart just to talk a little bit about CORE, since now and before border prohibition and reading the tea leaves, only because it does kind of talk about reputational risks that could happen to you in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably one of those things that people don't know about the Canadian market, but that frankly has become a little bit out of control. I'm going to share my own kind of personal views, which I don't do all that often as a lawyer that comes at it from a kind of neutral, objective, legal speak commentator. But in this case, I think this is an organization that has a mandate, and they've taken it and run and probably have gone a little too far, a little too fast. So let me introduce these folks. This is the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise. So CORE is the acronym. So the CORE is this organization that's set up within Global Affairs Canada. It's a creature of an order of council. And so what's relevant there is there's no regulations, there's no laws, there's no statute that govern this organization at all. It's a little bit of a fly-by-night organization, but it now has a large budget and quite a large staff. And what they're doing is launching investigations where there are complaints made by anybody in the stakeholders at large, NGOs or the like, to investigate these allegations of forced labor internationally by Canadian businesses, including in their upstream supply chain. And they have publicly announced and started investigating companies in the garment sector and the mining sector, and they're also empowered to look at the oil and gas sector. But they've launched now a number of investigations. I was looking at it. I see 9 major ones right now, and it's major names. Like we're talking Nike Canada, Ralph Lauren, Walmart, Hugo Boss, Diesel, Levi's, Zara, Guess, and then a couple on the mining side also. So in the apparel space, this has been a bit of a nightmare, frankly. Because what happens is that the CORE doesn't really have any ability to do anything. So they can investigate, but they don't have like subpoena powers. They can't force testimony or gather information. And so they are basically saying that unless you air out everything that you possibly can and participate fully in this process, they're going to assume that there is, in fact, forced labor and that you have things to hide. And it's been a bit of a problem in the Canadian space in that way. So the mere fact of, for example, of not fully participating in this process has been taken by the Corps as evidence of lack of supply chain transparency, and that the allegations made by anybody in the market are sufficient to initiate an investigation, and that the companies have to prove the negative, right? And so it's been very, very difficult from the company's perspective to address this. I will say, of course, let me maybe start with this premise. No one wants forced labor or child labor in their supply chains. Everyone wants to clean this up. It is not okay, and none of these companies are okay with it if it does come to be. The issue that I think many people have had with the Corps over time is this inability to explain yourself, the inability to gather information or participate in any meaningful way without having something thrown back at you. So the Parliament and the Government of Canada have actually frankly struggled with this organization. It's under review right now. The head of the longtime head of the Corps, or the former ombudsperson, just stepped down and has been replaced. So it's an organization that I think is yet to find its right role in the space. But I think it's fair to say that it's driven a lot of media attention in Canada to have these big companies, named and under investigation for forced labor. And it's certainly the last thing that these companies really have wanted. So I think I flagged this for information. I think it's highly relevant to kind of the different iterations and different ways that Canada's trying to deal with forced labor and honestly still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I feel like, Will, like it's good for anyone that has any interest in maybe take a look, because I was a little bit jarred the first time I went on there to see all the lit names there. And then when you actually dig into some of the documentation there, it was much more intrusive than I expected to even be. As somebody's going through a process of, investigation, it was kind of shocking that it's all out there before the world to see.
Yeah, and in some cases, it's a group of NGOs that don't particularly have much evidence at all, but the Corps is 100% taking that and running with it. And even when the allegations were denied, and this is where I think they went a little bit far, even when the allegations were denied, they make some statements that frankly were a little bit over the top. So the Hugo Boss one in particular irked me. The Corps said, in its report, they basically said, well, Hugo Boss has denied all the allegation, but Hugo Boss's response does not appear to consider fully the complex nature of the garment supply chain. And then they initiated the investigation. It's like, well, come on. Hugo Boss understands the nature of its supply chain and the complexities of the supply chain. And just because they're not fully participating in this process that frankly has no procedural safeguards, no, true legal protections or participation rights or anything of the sort in any kind of structured way, and with no penalties, doesn't mean that they don't understand their supply chain, frankly. And Hugo Boss is, I'm going to say they have a pretty good grasp and are one of the more compliant players out there, frankly. So I think that one was a little much.
So that is our Corps, Andy.
The one thing that I would say to your point and on the Corps, I would have to agree with you, Will. That is concerning. It's like, again, the intent is on the law, getting through there and checking things out. But on the same token, it sounds like the Corps folks, the bureaucrats in this case, are demonizing the companies. And it's like, if they are expecting any kind of acceptance, compliance, or support for this, they've got to take a whole different stance in that. And quite frankly, I think that those specific individuals, I can understand the government, but I would think that the specific individuals involved could be held liable for slander in that kind of context. I mean, this is new law and stuff, and I'm sure you're not really looking at trying to do something like that. But I guarantee you, if that were my company and somebody made that statement in there, man, I'd be badder than a wet hen. I'd be going out there and say, look, I'm going to part your hair with a hatchet on this. I'm going to file suit against you. Here is like, what's going on? So I'm sure there's a lot of Canadians that are sitting there going, what the hell did he just say? I would just be upset. And
yeah, I agree. That's exactly right, Andy. And so, that lack of, I think, balance or kind of procedural fairness in that system has effectively led companies to ignore this organization. And then that creates a snowball where the organization feels ignored and then writes a nasty report about the company not thinking about its supply chain. But that's not the case. It's the companies don't feel like they're going to be treated fairly in this process. And so that they don't want anything to do with this organization. Now that is changing. In fact, Hugo Boss itself actually decided to participate more than previous companies and was successful in getting the investigation dropped. They actually met with the complaining parties, the NGOs, and they went through this mediation process and ultimately resulted in them getting off the hook here. So there are different strategies in dealing with the core. We represented a party on the mining side where we did participate fully in the core process and were successful in having the investigation dropped. We were able to show that the evidence was not true, that we were not, engaged in the Xinjiang region, that the company previously had, closed the mine in question and all this kind of stuff. And so that works in some cases, but in others, it doesn't. And so the companies have a big decision to make as to what they're going to do. So yeah, it's been very difficult. I think we're going to see a kind of new and improved version of the core in the next little bit. Masad Hussein is the new interim ombudsperson, and we certainly wish him all the best of luck in getting the organization structured in a way where companies participate fully and that we can help put an end to forced labor.
All right, so let me say this: the takeaway out of this with the law that we talked about, the reporting requirements, and then in dealing with the core here and all that. Basically, what I'm hearing is that companies need to make sure that they are doing a good job of vetting their products, vetting their suppliers, vetting their customers, who you doing business with, and those kinds of things. And if you see any red flags in there, check it out, and don't, if in doubt, check it out kind of stuff. But, in going through, and it's not if you have a problem, it's like when you do, what do you do to dig into it? But to do that effectively, you probably need to look at is from the top down, but there needs to be a collaborative effort between your purchasing group, your customer service group, your compliance, your logistics, transportation, warehousing, IT, your legal, et cetera, whatever, even accounting wise and all of that, and look at things and, as you come across issues, talk about them as a whole team rather than just one group and looking at it and coming back trying to report. What do you agree with that, or I'm full of beans, or what?
100%. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, this is massive, and we haven't even started talking about detentions at the border yet, and your goods not actually getting into Canada, which is the next step. And we've just now started seeing detentions at the border. So now we really have three parts to the whole thing, right? We've got the core investigation we talked about. We've got the forced labor reporting, But we also have a prohibition on the importation of goods made of forced labor, as well as a prohibition on the importation of goods made of child labor. And by the way, I think we're the only country in the world that has a prohibition on the importation of goods made of child labor. And we're not talking about here forced child labor. We're talking straight child labor, that don't meet the definitions of that Canada have, which are actually quite low, right? You can't attend school in the way that you're supposed to attend school because you're working long hours. That's child labor if you're under the age of 18 and so on, right? And so that's huge. And we have started seeing detention at the border by Canada Border Services Agency, as I was saying. I think the solar panels are the big one there, because a lot of the polysilicon is from the Xinjiang region of China, which is kind of the established hotbed of forced labor globally. And we're going to run into some real issues there because it becomes, so in Canada, this is the interesting bit, forced labor is a tariff classification issue for all the trade nerds out there, where a chicken is no longer a chicken, right? A hammer is no longer a hammer, or a t-shirt is no longer a t-shirt. A t-shirt becomes a good made of forced labor. It gets reclassified under the HTS, the Canadian version, or HS code 98970000, right? Where you have a good made of forced labor, or child labor. And if that's the case, you get a redetermination of what your product is, and the hammer stops being a hammer, and it's a good made of forced labor, and then it can't come in. And so that's, we're seeing that. And in fact, what we've started to see also is, because of the U.S. issues around your detentions at the border under the UFLPA, right, under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the U.S., a lot of folks can't bring the products in. They can't prove the negative, right? It's so hard in your system to prove that the goods are not either from Xinjiang, or if they are, they're not made of forced labor. Like, proving that negative is almost impossible. So a lot of companies are exporting the goods out of the U.S., re-exporting them. Well, guess where the logical place to bring your goods is, right? It's right here north of the border. And so we've actually seen that, where companies were not able to meet the US CBP test, so they bring the products up to Canada and offload them here. If you're a CBSA officer, you're not going to love that idea. And so I think that's where we're starting to see a lot of action. And we recently saw, some US senators take issue with that, and frankly saying that Canada is not living up to its end of the bargain on forced labor, and that we need to do more. And I think that if you're a U.S. politician, renegotiating the USMCA, or the CUSMA as we call it here, you're going to want to force some more compliance onto Canada, and frankly, rightly so.
Well, and to that point, again, this comes back to, checking things out and whatnot. I get it. So as a whole, this is one of those where I know let's step back a minute. Most of the focus on forced labor has been isolated to China. There's other locations around the world that seem to have some issues. Some countries in Northern Africa, in the inner things, some of the issues even in South America you got to check out. The point being is that, though, with most of the things on China, the whole issue here is in dealing with it, you're dealing with a cultural issue over in that part of the world. And we either going to support it or not. And there's a lot of bureaucratic nightmares on this. Yes, the issue used to be, you're innocent until proven guilty. The U.S. in this has written the law from the standpoint that you're basically guilty and you got to prove your innocence out of this as far as the goods coming in. And like you said, it's difficult to prove. The other scenario is that everything is checked out just fine, except that, and especially if you go to in the U.S., and it'll be interesting to see as far as Canada goes. I know that in the U.S. there were $1 billion worth of goods seized within a year's time frame, I believe it was. of that $1 billion of goods, there was, I think, only 75 million that came directly from China. So then when you start looking it out, over 400 million, I forget, again, my memory's as long as a turtle's tail and just as fast. So I have to look at my notes, and I don't have them in front of me right now. But I believe Malaysia had over $400 million worth of goods that were manufactured in Malaysia that had Chinese components to it seized. And then Vietnam was the next one with like 350 million. It could be swapped out there, forgive me, but over $700 million, almost 75% of the goods seized came from two countries that were, basically, getting their, some of their components from China. How is that looked at as far as in Canada, that same kind of scenario with the forced labor enforcement?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the cases that you're talking about with Vietnam and Malaysia, part of that is the solar panels, right? Where the raw material, the polysilicon or the quartz that's being mined is perhaps from the Xinjiang region, which is like 50% of global production. Cotton is the other big one, right? So something like 20% of the world's cotton is from the Xinjiang region, but the t-shirts aren't made in that region. They're made, in Vietnam and Malaysia and Bangladesh and India or wherever, right? And so that's exactly right, Andy. So the goods are getting detained, but not because they're coming directly from that region. I think Canada has a lot of catch up. We don't have that reverse onus in place. Yeah. And frankly, CBSA is struggling, to put it simply. They don't have the tool because they don't have the reverse onus. How are they going to make that redetermination that the goods are actually from there? I think in some cases, kind of the indication that you couldn't prove the test in the U.S. might be taken with some kind of authority, but frankly, that's unlikely to survive challenge in my view. So that's why we haven't had these detentions. We've had one. And then not long after that one, it was released. And so it's only now in the last few weeks that we're seeing them take a run at this again. And who knows if they're going to stick, frankly. Yeah.
Like, Andy, this is where you're going to start to see that it's similar to the U.S. in terms of if a shipment's detained, they want the bills of lading and all that kind of stuff. Those are the pieces that we're now starting to expect to see from them. For sure, they are very challenged with catch up, like Will just said. I do know, though, in recent months, that team has started working. They definitely, well, I shouldn't say started. They've been working with the U.S. CBP for a while, but they definitely now are physically going to the facilities that U.S. CBP has and taking lessons learned and things like that. The gentleman in charge of that unit just recently testified in a committee and kind of reiterated they're still in the early stages and trying to work through it. Because we have different privacy laws in Canada, it's difficult to get information about this stuff. We don't really know how many what they've done or withheld. But to Will's point, for sure, we are seeing it, that some shipments are being detained and bills and materials and things like that are being requested to prove that it is not made from forced labor.
Okay. All right. So again, the takeaway from this is if you've got current products coming out of China, China's a big source still. You've got to go and do your due diligence and literally check things out, not just with your initial supplier, but go down to, 2 or 3 levels and see what you can find. That all said, I guess the other scenario here is, again, I said it before, you've got to vet your suppliers and vet your products when you're looking at it. So you're purchasing folks. I mean, there are, traditionally, and people are creatures of habit. So, everybody just immediately assumes China's the cheapest source and that's where I want to go and all that over, decades here. Now it's like, do I really want to deal with it? If you look at it holistically, is China really the best source? Yeah, you may get a very cheap manufactured product, but now the extra duties and taxes or the extra transportation and the extra basically compliance bureaucracy you have to deal with is it worth it? You got to take all that and add all that up and look to see it's, go from there. So, look at other sources around the world that help simplify some of that. So you don't even have to worry about it.
Yeah, I think that's right, Andy, and it's absolutely not just China; it's everywhere. I think that the biggest takeaway that I've kind of wrapped my head around over the last little bit is that the government of Canada and other governments also, for better or for worse, expect companies to know everything that is in their product and every part of where it's from all the way to the raw material. And that notion, a couple of years ago was absolutely bonkers. And impossible. And it's still, frankly, impossible for a large number of sectors. But that is the expectation. That's what the governments want you to get to. And they want you to be able to prove that you can, that the raw material, the product that was mined, where that was mined. And in a global commoditized world where, your cotton and the fibers have changed hands, 10 times and been rebatched together and in different countries is near impossible. But they're asking for that now, both from a reporting perspective, from a goods perspective, from an investigations perspective. That's what they want. And to the extent that companies can start doing that with AI, with other tools, with supply chain mapping, they're going to be ahead of the game.
And I wouldn't 100% agree with Will, but I'll also say, and it's not just on the forced labor file. It's now starting, we're seeing the same kind of border prohibition thoughts in sanctioned goods where you're going to have to prove it's not from a sanctioned country. And we're also now seeing it on the plastics file. Like in Canada, we're really on the plastics. So we now have to start basically knowing where your goods are of origin, right down to the atom, like what kind of plastic it was and where it was and where is it going to go when it finishes the end of life of its product. So it's kind of from, birth to grave now, which kind of reshifts your whole thinking. So if you're already doing those things, like Will just said, for forced labor, you will be in a better position to deal with all this additional data that governments are going to want as we move forward.
Well, and this is a good segue into, again, talking a little bit as far as solutions, and that'll be something that we'll get into in more detail in future shows here, Kim, but literally talking about the AI technology. There's no way you can do this manually, and you can attempt it. And if you're not proactive, you are already way behind the ball game on this. It's a teamwork effort, and the AI technology would be one of those that is going to help empower the right parties. And it could be different functions. It could be from an accounting perspective, the sourcing, the compliance, whatever, all of that to help deal with that, to say, here's the things in processing all this information. Here are the items that you need to look at. Rather than looking at everything, it pulls those needles out of the haystack to say, these are the items that require further investigation. There's possible flags here, and you're proactive with it.
You're so right, Andy. And there's so much more open source stored out there, data that people can use that they're probably not even leveraging. Like I've just even recently learned about ship pinging. Like you can actually follow where your goods are through satellite pinging to know, where they from a carbon footprint, but it would also be helpful for some of these other things that we're just talking about too, to prove that the goods hadn't transversed through some of those countries. So really exciting times in terms of tools and what's available, but still lots of work to do and rethinking about how we move our goods and how we're compliant with regulators.
All right, we're going to need to try and, because of time here, kind of wrap up some things here. So what else did you want to hit on here, Kim?
We're going to maybe read the tea leaves, and there could be some new legislation coming out this year. We expect to have from our Canadian government that will layer the due diligence piece in there, which will probably make it more imperative to make sure that you're doing things right, because you might have more ramifications legally. So, Will, I don't know if you want to try and read the tea leaves for us.
Yeah. So the government has promised new legislation by the end of the year on forced labor. And so we've all been going around and trying to figure out what that will be. For a while, we thought it might well be a UFLPA style reverse onus piece of legislation that assumes that goods from Xinjiang or other places are made of forced labor. We recently learned through the media that that was not the case, that that's not what they were looking at. So that leaves a couple options. The first is, as Kim mentions, kind of a true diligence bill. And we have had clients that are doing some consultations informally with the government on this. I think there are countries, of course, that have diligence bills, right? Like France has a duty of vigilance act. The Germans also, where you're at certain companies, and it's always the very largest companies, have to actually have processes in place to map their supply chain and to clean it up and to show that there's no forced labor and that they're, doing training and doing all the things that are necessary. That is, possible. And certain companies probably have the capabilities of doing that at the very highest level of sophistication of businesses. There's a real danger that they bring in that diligence type legislation to companies that are too small, that are frankly not there or not capable of doing that. But beyond that, that is a possibility.
So you're looking at, let's back up a minute. So forgive me for jumping in, but so there's new legislation being looked at, drafted to deal with, when you're saying dealing with the diligence of forced labor. So you're talking about actual
forcing companies to do things to clean up their supply chain. Yeah.
Okay. So to that extent, I guess what I would say, and Kim, I'm going to come to you on this one, as far as the action that somebody should be taking is you probably need to get involved with your trade associations that are respective to your industry and get involved in the committees or looking at, doesn't mean you have to be an active member from a leadership and get in the role. You need to participate to the meetings and look at what's going on, but they're representing that industry without naming a specific company. It's a way to push the issues and find out what's going on. Would that be good?
Yes, thank you, Andy. That would be awesome. The Importers and Exporters Association of Canada would probably be a good place for you to come because we are active in all these files. And it's not just importers and exporters. We definitely have all the service providers there. Will is an amazing member, along with many other law firms, accounting firms, you name it, everyone in the supply chain that supports importers and exporters. And this is exactly what we do. And we've spent a lot of time about forced labor today here too. But there's some other big files coming as well, which is plastics. We've kind of teased, Andy. We need a whole show on that. And also sanctions. There's a whole bunch of changes coming there as well. So if you have anything in the Canadian marketplace, we have value for duty. We're still trying to figure out how that's going to look and feel. This would be an excellent place to come to get your information. Obviously, your service providers are great too, but we definitely take it from a direct importer-exporter perspective, and you can quite often hear it right from the horse's mouth and have lots of other good counsel that will help you navigate. But I think too, Will, just pointing out, this is a marked difference I find between the U.S. and Canada in terms of how we lay out legislation. We try and read tea leaves. We try and guess. For many years now, our institutions aren't really working with us before things come out. We kind of find them after the fact or bits and pieces. So that's why it is really important to be with an association, because at least we kind of get the most current information with our partners. Where other people might struggle if you're trying to figure it out on your own.
Well, you definitely don't need to be complacent and say, well, let somebody else deal with it and comes at you. You need to, in this particular case, if you're not involved on the front end and trying to influence what needs to be in the appropriate legislation, then, you're going to suffer the consequences, and it will drive up costs usually because just to adhere to it.
You can't play ostrich here. You can't bury your head in the sand. And the ship has sailed, frankly, on ignoring forced labor or ignoring supply chain mapping or getting your ducks in a row.
Yes, agreed. And even from Will and I's perspective, because people will come up to us to help us, but the importer really has to be part of it because they're the ones that have the information and the knowledge and the requirements. So we can help them, but at the end of the day, they have to actually be doing it. So that's why it's really important that everyone's involved for sure.
Excellent. Well, I will say, this has been a good discussion, Kim. I really appreciate what we've gone through here. We're going to need to wrap this up because we could keep on talking. And, I could talk the horns off of Billy Goat in a New York second. And I think you can too. So I love it. Folks, listen, this is something that we need you to share our show. We need you to like it, whatever, subscribe to us, expand this out, let people know what's going on. Hey, let us know if you've got some questions or topics that you'd like for us to address. Bring them up, because I guarantee you we'll look at that and plow new ground with all this stuff to see if we can't get something going here for you. But all that to say, Will, thank you for joining us and very, very informative. I think this is we may be breaking this one up into a couple of shows here. Kim, though, goodness, I'm excited about this show. I think there's going to be a lot that we're going to be able to hit here.
I know. I'm very excited too, Andy. And I know that we do have a lot to discuss and share about Canada. So thank you so much again for giving us this forum, you and Lalo. Look forward to the journey together.
This is a great thing that you guys have going. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a real treat.
Well, with that, folks, we're going to turn this back over to you. I hope you have a great day and all the best. So simply trade, eh?
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.